Chaz has almost 30 years experience across all aspects of telecoms, IT services, technology, and now geospatial intelligence. Charles is focused on ensuring that EarthEye, which is the company that he works for, remains an agile and flexible company able to meet the changing needs of its customer as both EarthEye and the new space and EO industries continue to evolve. Charles has also experience of creating new markets, scaling up companies. He also holds board positions, advisory positions in data security and health technology companies.
Cool. Well, hopefully something a bit different in the mid-afternoon to kind of wake everyone up. I'm probably going from looking at digital twins at the micro level. The data, you can go down to the IP packet level, you can go down to the data contextual level, down to sensors and so on. So really, I'm going to take you, I think, out of this world, about 500 kilometers in the orbit to show you kind of how we use that kind of data to be able to understand what's going on around the world in relatively near real time. So think of it as a very, very macro outer space digital twin. So I think that's probably the easiest way to kind of bring it in for everyone here today. So so I'm just getting, there we go. So EarthEye, what do we do? We are really these days a data analytics company. Ultimately, we take satellite data, as I've said, and actually it can not only just be satellite data, it can be aerial data as well as drone data and so on. But it can be different types of data that is up in space. You have a lot of signals intelligence, SIGINT data that's up there, but also you have optical data, you have infrared thermal data, you've got hyperspectral data, which is now the new exciting time within the space industry, as well as radar data as well. But our job really is to be able to take all this data together for our customers and fuse it together to give them insights and ultimately what we call information advantage that their competitors don't have. So ultimately, we're taking whole sorts of open source and commercial data sources, pulling those together. So we're specialists in remote sensing. We're specialists in kind of AI, the machine learning and computer vision, because we have to be able to fuse that together and automate it, process it and automate it to quite a high level of accuracy, and really be able to do all of that at a scale that I'll show you that's quite considerable, but also do it at a low cost. So for a lot of our clients, it really takes away a large pain point of working with satellite data. Satellite data is pretty well known for being very big, very few data standards, and no two satellites are the same. So it's quite a difficult data set to kind of get your hands around. So we've been around now since 2017. The team really came together to put together high definition color satellites, video satellites in space, which there is a demonstrator still going around the Earth at about 7 kilometers a second, something like that. And it's still the best color video that's ever been put into space. But we pivoted the business at that time due to investor demand into data analytics, into downstream analytics of that. So really the great thing about our team is we really understand the sensors that are in space, because the team have designed sensors, they've built satellites, they've operated satellites as well. So we know how to get the most out of these things. And we do it for dual use clients as well. So we have most of our work is commercial with a little bit of defense as well around the world. So kind of the challenge that we set ourselves a few years ago was being able to monitor global supply chains. And we're kind of, the view here is kind of creating a kind of a digital twin of those supply chains wherever they were. And, at the moment we are now monitoring thousands of sites a day. They are dispersed globally in some very transparent countries and some very opaque countries. The aim is to revisit those every 2 to 3 days, worst case scenario, produce very accurate data, but also give a long history. Because if you really want to be able to look at the data, our history, our data goes back to about 2016. So even if we start monitoring a site today, we can go back to 2016. So have a long history, but as I said before, have a low cost. And you find that a lot of clients really want to be able to understand what's going on in their supply chains, whether they are looking at they're a miner who's looking at their clients, seeing how much they're using, looking at their competitors. If it's brokers, being able to understand how much capacity there is in the market, all sorts of commodity and equity traders and so on. So they're all very interested in understanding and having that little, as I said before, information advantage, that competitive edge that this data provides. So how do we do that? We have a platform we call Savant, and that really does all this fusion, data fusion, and with the AI to monitor and report on those thousands of sites. We focus on kind of metals and mineral supply chains, so things like copper, nickel, steel, iron ore, soon to be scrap steel, as well as things like titanium dioxide and sulfuric acid, all very key things within people's critical metals and materials supply chains. And we kind of, if you look at the graphic on the bottom left, the view is we look at these global sites. We use, as I said before, optical data, see what we can see, whether that could be smoke plumes, hotspots, and so on. Thermal data could be hotspots. Radar is kind of densities and so on. And we then kind of start to count things like those hotspots and their intensities, as well as exhaust plumes, as well as night lights and stockpiles and water exhausts and all sorts of things that are either primary, secondary, or tertiary indicators. And we pull all that data together, and in our insight engine, we start to be able to produce what you can see there in the yellow strips in the third box along, where the red is ultimately saying, we can identify if locations are active or inactive, yellow being active, blue being inactive. And from that, we're then able to produce in the bottom of that third piece, a view of being able to produce data for our clients that ultimately gives them leading indicators. So sometimes between 30 and 90-day leading indicators of activity levels, production levels, emission levels, and so on, as well as trading signals as well for our clients. So although that's quite a simple thing of what we do, it kind of condenses it. It is a complex operation. And as you see on the next side, this is a bit more for the technical people, potentially there are in the room. The aim is we take on the left-hand side data from all sorts of different satellite operators. We ingest that into our AWS platform, again, highly scalable and so on. We process it, automate it, analyze it, and ultimately our clients then just take the data via API. The data is published on a daily basis around midday every day, and so on. So, and I think, as I said before, satellite data is difficult. It does have completely different data standards between everybody. So I'll just move on to kind of show you a bit more of the kind of the basic things that you can do. You can monitor. Here is a very high resolution image of Saudi Arabia. You can identify all sorts of different objects on the ground, object detection classification here in the middle, as well as land use classifications as well. What's roads, what's buildings, what's forest, what's grassland, and so on. And that's kind of one of the building blocks of what you do with AI and Earth observation putting together. But taking that to another level, work actually we've been doing with Ian as well, is kind of automated land class mapping and change detection at scale. So being able to look at, here we've got the Isle of Wight, and being able to understand how has the land cover changed over each, on an annual basis over the last 5 or 6 years. And you'll be able to then use the machine learning algorithms to be able to automate that process. Again, working with one of our partners there, the UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology, it allows you to understand how that changes. And that becomes a foundational piece for people who want to be able to, potentially create a digital twin of biodiversity or as carbon sequestration and so on. And, on the bottom of this slide, so we've got the Isle of Wight on the top left and top right. On the bottom of the slide, again, this is looking at very specific locations for clients to understand their assets, to understand, how are their assets which they are returning back to nature, how are they performing year on year? Is the biodiversity actually coming back into those? So again, it's understanding that rate of change and so on. Going back to Savant now, which is kind of one of our core products. I've said here, we're going to be looking at steel. We're monitoring between copper, nickel, steel, and iron ore about 1,200 sites a day. Those satellites, as I said, kind of revisit every 2 to 3 days wherever they are in the world. For our clients, what it allows them to do, is ultimately make better decisions earlier, and ultimately increase their profitability. And there are big things here, especially in this day of fake news. It's about validating kind of market information. It's really understanding what your supply chain is doing. What are your suppliers? Some of our clients want us to check that their suppliers aren't telling them incorrect information about their production capabilities. It's about monitoring macroeconomic activity, or very regional or very specific areas or provincial levels of economic activity and so on around the world. So really, you're able to bring out very large amounts of information using these very broad brush data sources to be able to give people an idea of how the world is performing, or different areas of the world are performing, and how they're changing. Ultimately, it's that what's important to them is understanding, this day versus yesterday, this week versus the week before, this month versus the month before, this quarter, and so on. And it's always just understanding those rates of change and those deltas between those that really allow them to understand how their supply chains are working. So at a high level, these are, I'll give you a bit more deeper dive. This is kind of how we look at 3 steel sites in China. These what we kind of call DNA strips, the yellow, grey, and blue ones. They are yellow is showing there. We've seen activity. Grey, ultimately with satellites, especially with 500 kilometers away, there is sometimes cloud. There is sometimes too much smoke or fog or pollution. Or blue is ultimately, it was actually inactive, and so on. So from those and the intensity of the signals that we get, so instead of it just being a binary on or off activity, the graph above those, the line here in D-long steel, for instance, that sits above the yellow and grey and the blue, that actually takes into account the intensity and the volume of all those signals that we've identified, that shows you how active is that site as well. So you can see that actually before 2020, ultimately before COVID hit, it was a very active site. After COVID hit, it hasn't really come back to full production at that location, and so on. So the aim is you'll be able to go down to those individual assets and really monitor what's their normal level of activity, and are they above or below that, and then you can then aggregate that back up to understand, how much copper or how much steel and so on is coming onto the market as well. So that's how we start to build it up. And the kind of interesting things that you can do from that is then mix it with other information. So this is we were asked to look at a Russian steel mill that really focuses on creating military grade steel, and we were monitoring this before Ukraine. And ultimately you can see here right in the middle, the Q4 21 abnormal, there's a big green peak in there, and that was them really doubling production before the invasion of Ukraine and so on. After Ukraine, the Ukraine war started, you can see that not only did production fall, but also sanctions did take in effect, but they only had an impact of about 3 months and so on, by which time the Russians have redone that. And also now, you can see from adding in kind of open source intelligence, which you've seen some of that earlier, I think today, and linking it to news items, you'll see they started paying overtime in kind of September 22, such that production went up again. And actually, what's really interesting now is I was on a call this morning with our finance clients in that the European steel production has significantly gone up in the last month, but it's nothing to do with Europe at all. It's actually due to the steel mills in eastern Ukraine, which are now which have been under Russian control, are really at full production, which they haven't been before, and that's really pushing up the amount of steel that's being produced for the Russian war effort. So you can start to kind of pull these kind of bits of analytics out of the data that we're collecting on a daily basis. Or what it allows us to do, going back to the Chinese examples, is that we can actually estimate then how many metric tons of steel or copper or nickel or iron or not iron ore, but scrap steel and so on is being produced on a monthly basis or on a weekly basis, and so on, site by site by site. And that really gives people that granularity to understand, which suppliers should I be contracting with, which one should not, and it gives them a kind of a good heartbeat to be able to understand who should I be talking to either get the best deal for processing my iron ore or copper concentrate or so on, or who should I be avoiding as well. But it gives them that kind of whole network of the global supply chain of what's happening. You could also go down, and this is something we've done in Belgium, taking a site and actually, and this is kind of taking from 500 kilometers away, breaking a site down like Dunkirk for ArcelorMittal here. You break it down into not just the site level, but also into the individual blast furnaces. So, and also the different types of industrial facilities there, because for information, it's quite interesting. So last year, for instance, a lot of the blast furnaces were off, but people thought they were on because they could see heat signatures. But actually, it was actually the coke ovens that were on that were producing gas that they were selling back to the national grid. So they were just producing, they just became a gas supplier rather than a steel supplier, and so on. So if you can start to see all these this kind of level of granularity, as is shown here, you can start to really break down and get a much more accurate understanding of how each site is working. So the impact of energy prices in Europe kind of switched off, reduced number of blast furnaces, people didn't use their electric arc furnaces so much, and so on. So that had a big impact to understand how much steel is coming onto the market, how much energy is being used, and understanding forecasting demand and so on. So, we can actually get to a very good granular level, again, from doing it from 500 kilometers away and doing it to a very high level of accuracy. So talking about accuracy, we've been working with a company, and we were able to understand that look at their weekly steel production in the US, and we were on average between plus and minus 2.5%, but that kind of went from about 4.2% to minus 2.5% variance. But we were able to give that data to the market kind of 90 days earlier. So to be fair, again, that accuracy is pretty good, and actually we've done some more analysis on that, and really getting that accuracy to plus or minus 2.5% is quite significant. So again, across 16 sites in the US, you're quite accurate when the client says, could we pay you not to publish that information, please? The other side of it is you can then start to, once you know how these things work, how much they're producing, you can understand how many Scope 1 emissions these sites are producing as well, to be able to validate it as well. And probably one point there, and it comes on the last slide too, is saying that there is no privacy from space. So you can look wherever. I mean, you can look yourselves. You use Google Earth and so on, but there are other things that are available to most people. that you can go and have a look and see what's going on anywhere in the world whenever you want to, and so on. So depends on the resolution of how good that is, but you're still able to go and have a look around. So you can understand company production levels, and again, that helps some of our clients who have contracts with their supply chain to say, are you producing? Are you giving me that 70% of production that you have promised me, and so on? And we're able to then help them with that discussion. You can then aggregate all this data up to a country level. So again, understanding how well is a country doing, especially if it's a major proportion of their GDP. And here we take all this data in China, and this is also something where you've got to understand bias as well. So in a lot of reporting there is bias, and you can see here between what we see as China's production levels in blue at the bottom and China's reported production levels in purple. You do see that there is an element of bias within that, and if you take into account the amount of iron ore that's being delivered into China and so on, you can quickly work out what that delta is to understand what is the true number between what's reported, and that might move the market, but also what's actually happening. And at some point there is a correction. A market correction does come along, and one happened on iron ore a few weeks ago. But you get that level of insight to be able to really understand what is happening. Other things that you can do, and this is some more recent work as well that we've been doing, again looking at supply chain and so on, and digital twins, looking at stockpiles around the world and being able to look at all those different stockpiles and being able to try and get a daily image of those, to be able to identify and validate how much, in this instance, iron ore is on the ground at those locations. And the graph on the left, although not self-explanatory, shows we're about within a plus or minus 5% of that, with data that is of a non-consistent quality. So it's quite tricky data for us to process and analyze, but we're able to take that data and really start to understand what's happening within it. So again, you can really start to pick out quite significant detail and valuable detail for clients around the way. The other side is then now also how we validate our data. So not only do we validate the data against company reports that are published generally quarterly, we also do it against industry reports that are sometimes quarterly, sometimes monthly as well. Some of the data is also weekly. And we find that actually, as you can see here on the left-hand side, we're looking at copper production in Chile. What we're seeing in kind of the light green versus in third versus the International Copper Study Group, we track pretty well across that. And if you then take it up to a country level, you can actually understand. You can understand that we are very, very accurate against the amount of production that's there. But again, we're giving that up to the day as it's done, rather than waiting 90 days or 180 days, even for some of those figures. So, and this is something that we've not really released yet, but kind of coming out of that digital twin is, what we're doing is then actually saying, okay, well, let's answer some of those questions. So we've created from that and a daily buy-sell signal, a trading signal from all this data, to understand that, taking into account all the fundamentals that impact the copper price and also now the steel price, we have been able to produce a trading signal, that's a daily trading signal, that gives us about a 37% per annum return. And if you actually reinvest, it will be about an 85% annual return as well over the last 5 years. So $100 invested is now just under $300 back from that, just in making a simple way of getting a good return. And it just shows you how accurate this data is, even though it is quite macro. quite big, and it's not on the terrestrial, it's not on the ground, it can deliver significant insight to people along the clients, especially if you're looking at national critical infrastructure, supply chains, and so on, and really wanting to understand, am I going to be able to get this? As we said, we've had an issue recently with Turkey. A lot of the steel, they do most of the steel recycling. So scrap steel goes into Turkey, goes into their electric arc furnaces in eastern Turkey. But unfortunately, eastern Turkey was the area most hit by the earthquake. So all those electric arc furnaces, we could see that they had gone off. We could see did return and so on. So you get really good invaluable insight into what's possible by using these type of data sources. I'm not saying this data source should be used on its own. You can actually then layer it with other data sources as well, which is what, to be fair, we all do on a day-to-day basis. And then going on from that, I mean, from our side, it is being able to kind of create these kind of digital twins of these global supply chains, and we have more exciting ones to look at too as well. So we're looking at things like scrap steel, aluminium, zinc, lead, cobalt, lithium, all these things that people are very interested in. But you can see now that the countries as well as companies are really wanting to be able to understand where all their supply chains come from, who's involved in them, how diverse they are, how resilient they are, also how secure they are as well. We have seen some of our clients' shipments suddenly disappear, and you're talking tens of millions of pounds of copper just suddenly disappearing around the world. But the aim is to be able to take it, the real challenge for us is to be able to take that kind of circular economy and also be able to track from mine through to port, the export port to the import port, as you can see on the graphic, into the smelter, and then downstream into the consumer side, and being able to say, how do you actually provide that traceability through the whole thing? So that for us is another challenge ahead around traceability. But simply, there is no privacy from space. So you can look at anything you want to, but the data isn't good enough to be able to identify a person in any way, or any kind of facial or the number plates, or even very difficult to actually identify a car type or an individual car and things like that. So, but it is big enough to be able to kind of get significant insight into many areas in the civil and the defence side, quite cost effectively these days. But hopefully that kind of shows you how this kind of data, as I said before, as is macro data, it isn't terrestrial, it is from space. It can monitor these geographically diverse supply chains or projects, and without you actually even having to put a foot on the ground, or a boot on the ground. So there we go. And that was kind of it from me. I hope that was too fast for you, Ian, or I haven't missed anything you wanted me to say.
Thank you, Chaz. No, that was brilliant. Certainly an interesting subject for myself, I must say.